Good morning. Welcome to the Palm Sunday version of Unity of Springfield Adult Education, World Religions, and History of New Thought class. My name is John Brocker, and we'll be completing the review of the golden nuggets from the book Still Here by Ram Dass, Embracing, Aging, Changing, and Dying. Please join me in a centering prayer to begin our class. If I had my life to live over, I'd like to make more mistakes next time. I'd relax. I'd limber up. I'd be sillier than I've been this trip. I would take fewer things seriously. I'd take more chances. I'd climb more mountains, swim more rivers. I'd eat more ice cream and less beans. I would perhaps have more troubles, but I'd have fewer imaginary ones. You see, I'm one of those people who live sensibly and sanely, hour after hour, day after day. Oh, I've had my moments, and if I had to do it over again, I'd have more of them. In fact, I'd try to have nothing else, just moments, one after another, instead of living so many years ahead of each day. I've been one of those persons who never goes anywhere without a thermometer, a hot water bottle, a raincoat, and a parachute. If I had to do it again, I'd travel lighter than I have. If I had my life to live over, I'd start barefoot earlier in the spring, stay that way later in the fall. I'd go to more dances. I'd ride more merry-go-rounds. I'd pick more daisies, and I'd live each moment more. By Nadine Stair. For those of you that missed last week's class, the author Ram Dass was born Richard Alpert. He was an esteemed psychology professor at Harvard, was then fired, and released to seek his mystical journey, leading him to India and returning to minister around spiritual growth with an Eastern bent, dying practices, and other social service and health ventures. He was a teacher and a co-teacher, a teacher to and a co-teacher with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Before continuing with the chapter on shifting roles, I'd like to share a story in this book about shifting perception. And I'd also like to say I truly miss having a room full of people to make comments and assist in clarifying important concepts that are being shared. So this is a story about Kelly's introduction. Kelly was one such friend for me. When Kelly was 10, he was hit on the head with a baseball. And when fluid and pressure built up inside his skull, the emergency room misdiagnosed the situation twice. This resulted in Kelly's becoming a quadriplegic, requiring round-the-clock care. When we met, Kelly was in his late 20s, and despite his severe limitations, he had attended college and lived a rich, full life, full of interests and loving friends. He had come to one of my lectures, and his presence there in the gurney, with his drooping head and drooling mouth, drew me to him. Although he couldn't speak, he could spell out his thoughts on an alphabet board, with an assistant's help. Kelly told me via this board that he was having difficulty with his anger and frustration, and that he wanted my help. This began a friendship that lasted 8 years until his death. At first, I had difficulty spending time with Kelly. In fact, it took me 6 months of twice-a-week visits before I was able to quiet down enough to sit next to his grotesquely deformed body without an intense emotional reaction. Then I finally met Kelly the soul, who existed in this body but was not trapped in identification with that form. Once that shift had occurred for me, it was smooth sailing between us. Our souls were able to meet in the midst of the physical suffering and find appreciation together. So once Kelly asked to be allowed to introduce me at a lecture I was giving to a large conference of professional healers. I was uneasy at first, wondering what would happen, but I finally agreed. When Kelly was wheeled out on the stage, there was a stunned, uneasy silence as the audience reacted to Kelly's circumstance. Then, with the help of an assistant, he spelled out his introduction, letter by letter, on the board. His assistant read the message. R.D., Kelly's name for me, says, "We are not our bodies. Amen." And the audience gave him a standing ovation. So the next part, as we're going through this, is talking about shifting roles. And last week we talked some about the concepts of the ego being the player in this material world that we live in, and the soul, which is the searcher who has the opportunity to observe and learn from this interaction that the ego has with the world, and hopefully experience awareness or Atman or God or creative force and get assistance from that. Here's a quote by Longfellow. "Age is an opportunity no less than youth itself, though in another dress. And as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars, invisible by day." So there's the concept that, we tend to see the ego in a negative light because we can get so attached and so caught up in ego focused and mistake and think that the ego is all of us rather than just the part that plays the roles. And Buddha, in fact, learned this in his experiences. And here's a little story that goes into this. And Buddha learned this lesson on his path to enlightenment. He heard a bunch of great yogis sitting in meditation day and night, eating no more than a grain of rice every day. So he joined them. And he did this for a while until he realized he was assaulting the very vehicle that allowed him to travel a spiritual path, his body. That's when he decided to travel the middle way, not indulging himself, but not remaining an ascetic. A lot of followers left him at that point, but it was the appreciation of reality, the good and the bad, that led to his own enlightenment. And the ego's an actor by trade. So we get to try things out, experience things. It's just that we need to have that soul observer, that soul awareness to keep us in check so we don't think that the ego is all there is, and the experience of the ego is all that there is. Rather than wonder what new role we can invent for ourselves in the world, then, the question that concerns us might be put this way. How can we, as aging people, make our wisdom felt in the world? So we keep changing. Another shifting role is sex, and people don't, find it difficult to talk about that because it does change, and it doesn't mean that there aren't people who are 70, 80 years old that continue to experience sex and active sex and some forms of sex, and there's the yogis who can carry around weights from and all kinds of things, and it's there's no question that with taking care of the body and good self-discipline that can continue. But it just seems like it ends up being less of a focus as we age, and it makes room for other interests, other desires, other things that we might want to learn beyond that. So there's this little story of the frog. So this man's out on a walk, and he hears, psst, psst, hey, can you help me out? Once again, he stops and looks around and says, psst, psst, hey, can you help me out? He doesn't see anything, and then he looks down a little more carefully, and he sees this frog. And though he's a little embarrassed to talk to the frog, he asked, did you speak to me? And much to the man's surprise, the frog answers, yes, indeed. Could you help me out? The man is intrigued and says, well, what do you want? And the frog replies, well, I'm under a curse. If you would kiss me, I would be freed of the curse, and I would turn into a beautiful woman who would love you and serve you, and I would care for you, warm your bed, and make you so happy. The man stands there for a moment, reflecting, and then picks up the frog and puts it in his pocket and walks on. After a few minutes, the frog says, hey, you forgot to kiss me. And the man says, well, you know, at my age, I think it might be more interesting to have a talking frog. So, it just might be a little more of a novelty. So the myth of the individual is the next little section. And, we, in our culture, we look forward to the next generation, to our children. There's a lot of focus to helping the next generation live better than us and have more than us and move through life in a way that's beneficial to them, and that they carry on something for us. And we don't really think about, and I really noticed this in my parents, in their generation particularly, that they didn't really think about the fact that they were becoming more dependent, and or that they had something to give and offer. So the myth of the individual is that we're just out there on our own. We raise our kids, they go off, especially in our culture, it's so mobile. And then we're just like sitting there. And are we, where's that connection between the generations? What's our role in having that continuity through the generations. So one of the things that Ram Dass talks about is in the conscious aging is, of course, using technology to keep those connections. And there's some limitations with the amount of intimacy that we can have. And I think it's still very important to have that. And it's not a one-way street. You know, even though we may start to have some dependencies at some point in time, it's also something that's a connection for the younger generation to look to their elders as both role models, but also just something that it's a part of who they are, part of identity. He also talked about some of the Native American cultures where a person has a focus on the last few generations before them and then a responsibility to look after the next few generations after them. And that they often are currently becoming more and more frustrated because they feel like the younger generation doesn't listen to them. And, well, of course. And he really is calling us to, well, maybe we need to foster this whole idea that we have this wisdom to offer and some skills to offer. And so one of the things that he was involved in was called an elder circle. And so it was a group of people, middle-aged and older men, and they would have a talking stick and be in a group where the elders would be in the middle, and they would share the stick, and the younger folks would still be in the room. They would just be outside of the circle, so they were just listening. And it was a way of kind of codifying a process. And then each of the old elders would, when they had the stick, they would spend some time sharing what they thought was wisdom. And sometimes it was the first time that people found that voice for themselves. And that maybe it takes a little bit of practice. Maybe it takes some awareness to even look for it in order to share it. Also, in terms of the dependency and asking for help, because there is a wisdom in dependency as well. And there's something to be shared. I've worked a lot with folks with substance use problems, and one of the struggles that a lot of people had was calling their sponsor. You know, I can't tell you the number of times I said, well, did you call your sponsor before you had your relapse? Oh, no, I didn't even think of that. And how could I do that? You know, I don't want to go and just lay all my problems and all my negativity on my sponsor. They'd be so disappointed and so on and so forth. And I would say, well, so I started to have people just call their sponsor, not because they were in trouble, not because they wanted to relapse, but just so that they would break the water on that. And then I also told them the story, and this is true because I've had a lot of sponsors and people who have been sponsors share this with me, is that when a sponsee or a person that's new into the program calls their sponsor, it's kind of a person feels respected that they would call you. They feel trusted, that it's an indication that you respect their recovery, and it's touching that someone's willing to put their vulnerability in their life in your hands. So, and when that's shared, sometimes the person says, oh, okay, maybe this dependency is not all terrible. Maybe this asking for help and being in this other role isn't the worst thing in the world, and that it's not something to be ashamed of. So, another thing that we tend to do in the shifting of the roles is this tendency to want to hold on to power. We don't want to give up a role of, supervising people, having people come to us, being financially well off and being able to help out, and having the status. So Ram Dass tells a little story, kind of about the power of fame and how that can change. So he says, well, years back, I had a humbling experience that taught me this lesson firsthand. I was vacationing on Martha's Vineyard with Tara and Danny Goleman, who was like a younger guru brother to him. Danny's book, Emotional Intelligence, had been on the New York Times bestseller list for many months. We were walking down the beach where I was used to being recognized and made much of. A man came up to us and said, "You look familiar." I started to smile and looked appropriately humble. Then he said, "Aren't you Dan Goleman?" And I realized he wasn't talking to me at all. My humble smile froze on my face. And then the man said, referring to me, "Is this your father?" Needless to say, my attachment to the role of social star was shaken to the ground in an instant. And that's just a little funny story, but that's one of the things we have to realize, that that's going to change, and that's really, really okay. Okay, another issue that comes on is retirement anxiety. A lot of us, and I would say myself included, when I'm looking at retiring, I want to make sure that I have something to do. I don't look at just sitting in a chair and not doing anything. So, I have some plans which are being messed with currently. So we'll see what happens with that. And so we tend to come up with new roles to get into. And I had a conversation with my brother maybe a year ago. And he said, because he has already retired, and he said he was told and advised to take a few months when he first retired and just do nothing. And then decide what it is that you want to do. Because it might be different things that you want to do when you actually are retired and you really do have the choices than what you think you want to do while you're still entangled in all your roles while you're working. As Gay Lusky has noted, after being applauded for busyness and productivity, there's a guilt about stillness. This attitude is endemic to our materialistic, youth-oriented culture and counterproductive to our approach to conscious aging, which requires a great deal of stillness in order to waken the wisdom within us. So, of course, we don't have to wait to retire to do that. We don't have to wait to get old to do that. We have the opportunity to really practice spending time in the silence, practice time just being instead of doing. which is of course a wonderful practice to help us with. This next little piece is around the gift of service. And there's this one quote that to me is really striking and maybe really the centerpiece of this entire book. He says, "There is a relationship between what we need to learn and what we do in the world. It's interesting when you stop thinking of spiritual practice as what you do on your meditation cushion and realizing that your karma is your dharma. In other words, what we do in the world, our dhamma, is our spiritual practice." It's kind of startling, really, when you think about it. And all the more reason to be more conscious in what we choose. Most of us cannot expect kudos for participating in the activities that appeal to us in older age. There are no awards for planting gardens, or playing with our grandchildren, or taking stock of our lives, no social payback for practicing mindfulness, becoming conscious of our fears, unloosing the mental knots of lifetimes spent striving and achieving. And as we age, it is helpful to begin to release our need for social approval. As many older people have told me, one of the primary gifts of age is no longer caring so much what others think of us and feeling free to be ourselves. Ideally, this process of freeing ourselves from cultural expectations and becoming mindful of our true values can begin long before we enter old age, and so that our inner resources are strengthened when we need them later on. And I also think that maybe sometimes some people have more of that in their personality. There's people in my life, my daughter, for example, who, and really my younger son as well, who were pretty much impervious to peer pressures even through junior high and high school. They just didn't care. They would talk about something that somebody was doing, and we would ask, well, didn't you kind of want to go ahead and follow and do with them? And didn't you have any urges? Or they just go, no. It's like, no. Why would I just follow somebody else because they were doing it? And I don't know. I felt blessed that my children had that. Eccentricity or eccentricity. Here's another poem about just being who you are. When I am an old woman, I shall well wear purple, with a red hat which doesn't go and doesn't suit me, and I shall spend my pension on brandy, and summer gloves and satin sandals, and say, we've no money for butter. I shall sit down on the pavement when I'm tired, gobble up samples in shops, and press alarm bells, and run my stick along the public railings. And make up for the sobriety of my youth, I shall go out in my slippers in the rain, and pick the flowers in other people's gardens, and learn to spit. You can well wear terrible shirts, grow more fat, eat 3 pounds of sausages at a go, or only bread and pickles for a week, and hoard pens and pencils and beer mats and things in boxes. Yes, but now we have clothes to keep us dry and pay the rent, and not swear in the street and set a good example for the children, and must have friends to dinner and read the papers. But maybe I ought to practice a little now, so people who know me are not too shocked and surprised when suddenly I am old and start to wear purple. So it's important to, take some time, create some opportunities for just doing that, building in some time to consider really deep questions about who we are, where we are, what it all, and how it all makes sense. Slowing down really is the only way to take advantage of that, which is really that present moment awareness. One of the things that he talks about in one of his experiences when Ram Dass was in India is he went to the burial grounds and also spent time where they did burial services in the Ganges River, and where they really were trying to desensitize their students to death and just how present and death is and how impermanent the ego is and life is. And although the cemetery type of learning isn't available in the West, there are some examples. There's in Shelley's poem, Ozymandias, he says, "I am Ozymandias, king of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." But the next lines reveal, "Nothing beside remains. The lone and level sands stretch far away." So, and we know that if people aren't around, and even the changes that start to occur if we're not maintaining brick buildings and so on and so forth over a few generations, and grass and trees start to grow through and wild animals, and there won't be anything left either in 100 years. It's just going to be gone. It'll just get crushed by just nature. So present moment awareness, obviously, is very important in just being conscious and making conscious choices. There's a really important piece about letting go of the past. And we really do need that. Letting go of the past is important. Unfinished business, we cannot transform what we have not blessed. So Ram Dass talks about a story where while he's traveled a lot, mostly always he was on the go. He was not a sedentary person, and he didn't really have a place that he called home. So he's always driving around, but he would collect photographs and clippings and of everything that he did, and they realized he was and they had to put him in a storage place because he just had too much. He couldn't even carry him around with him anymore. And then at some point he decided, well, this is just too much, because he'd been at this for many years. And so finally he went through and he decided, look, I just have to get rid of it. And as he starts going through with it, he felt all these tugs of, oh, I remember that. Oh, that was so nice. Oh, I love them. and he doesn't want to forget them. And what he decided to do was that he says, well, I'm going to have to just burn these, or I'm just going to have way too much crap that I'm storing up. So he decides, but as he's doing this, he's realizing that it's important for him to honor and bless and let go of the past as he went ahead and burnt it. And that sometimes had some painful emotion related to it, and it was important. But it freed him up. And of course, at the time of writing this book, he had some more boxes of stuff that he's collected over time. And he is looking at, okay, now I need to have another burning party and go through this process of letting go. And I think that's something we all need to do from time to time. We need to stop, look, okay, so what baggage am I carrying around from the past? It's just, I'm replaying it in my mind, I'm replaying it. What do I need to let go of? Another part of awareness, which is not present moment, but when we're practicing present moment, we are become aware of it, and that's our attachment to future. Especially to the fears of things that we think might happen. Now during this coronavirus, COVID-19 period of time, stock market's gone, Yahoo, 401ks are really changing, where people are winning and losing 5-6 figures on a daily basis. And the process, he talks about the process of shedding attachment of the future is fearlessness and facing those fears, getting up close to them, observing them. And it's really important to be in touch with the soul to make sure that we're not devastated by those. That it's really important that we have that perspective from that observer soul position to allow us to deepen into facing these fears. Time and change. As the ego moves in terrestrial time, the soul exists in soul time. The soul thinks in terms of endless eons. By learning to remain in both time perspectives, we experience a stillness that enables us to accept the turbulence of change and also to catch our breath, freeing ourselves from the ego's attachment to things remaining as they are, and acquainting ourselves with what exists externally each present moment. We learn to approach change with curiosity rather than dread, and to be more comfortable with not knowing than we have been before. So there's this one story, and I've told this before. I think Jon Kabat-Zinn had this in one of his books. But it's a good story, and it illustrates this point. Once there was a farmer in a village that had a horse that he treasured. One day the horse ran away, and the farmer's neighbor came to his house to offer his condolences. "I'm so sorry for your loss," he said, trying to be a good friend. "You never know," the farmer says. The very next day, the horse came back, leading a beautiful wild mare alongside him. Again, the neighbor piped in. "That's wonderful. What a stroke of good luck," the farmer replied. "You never know." the farmer replied. A few days later, the farmer's son was trying to break the wild horse in, was thrown to the ground and broke his leg. Of course, the neighbor came over to say how sorry it was that things had gone so badly. The farmer replied, "You never know." A short time later, the Cossack army came through the village in search of young men to fight in the war. But since the farmer's son's leg was broken, he was allowed to stay at home. "Aren't you a fortunate man?" the neighbor said when he heard the news. You can guess what the farmer replied. The point is, we never know what changes will come or how they'll affect us. In the long run, the law of impermanence, anicca, requires that if we want to reduce our suffering, we learn to weather change as gracefully as possible, remaining open to what we do not know. So sometimes there's plannable work, and then, sometimes you have to do. Or as the Marines say, you change what you can change, and what you can't change, you paint. Facing dread of the future is an excellent vehicle for entering into the spiritual dimension. We must be willing to be open to all that the moment contains, including that which seems most threatening. We cultivate fearlessness and familiarize ourselves with our own demons. A little bit about dying, and then we'll talk just a little bit about stroke yoga. Quote from the Gita: "Never the spirit was born, the spirit shall cease to be, never. Never was time, it was not, end and beginning our dreams, birthless and deathless and changeless. Abideth the spirit forever, death doth not touch it all." So there's just a few things we can learn from some of the masters. A Zen student once asked his master, "What happens after one dies?" Zen master says, "I do not know." "How can that be? You're a Zen master." "Yes," he replied, "but I'm not a dead Zen master." Some other Western folks have some things to say about death. Plato says, "Death is nothing more than a migration of the soul from this place to another." Emerson says, do you see, oh my brothers and sisters? It is not chaos and death. It is form and union and plan. It is eternal life. It is happiness." C.G. Jung, after his 1944 heart attack: "What happens after death is so unspeakably glorious that our imagination and our feelings do not suffice to form even an approximate conception of it." Goethe said, "I am just as certain as you see me here that I have existed 1,000 times before, and I hope to return 1,000 times more." A few people, some notable people when they're dying. After Gandhi was shot at close range while walking across his garden, he died with the name of Ram on his lips because he'd spent a lifetime repeating God's name. Ram Dass's guru, Neem Karolik Baba, uttered, "Om Jai Jagadish Hari." Honor to the one who makes the world turn, just as he was dying. As a Japanese Zen master approached death, reminded that he had yet to compose his death poem, he picked up his pen and scribbled, "Birth is thus, death is thus. Verse or no verse, what's the fuss?" And then he died only moments later. His stepmother Phyllis, just as she was about to die, said, "Richard, sit me up." I did as she asked, putting one hand on her chest to keep her from falling backward and one hand on her back to keep her from falling backward, and my head against her head to keep it from rolling. Then Phyllis took 3 long, slow breaths and died. This is just the way the great Tibetan masters have always done it. Sitting up 3 long breaths, and then they're gone. How did she know? Not everyone dies in so easy a manner. When he was at his end, the cantankerous founder of Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls, was giving his nurse a hard time. "Please lie down, Dr. Perls. You shouldn't be sitting up," she begged, to which he replied, "Nobody tells Fritz Perl what to do." And then he died. So, a little bit of stroke yoga. Basically, what he says is he used when he went through the stroke, and it was a very debilitating stroke. He was been in a wheelchair ever since on to his death. And he'd had all kinds of therapies. And he said he used all of the yoga, everything that he'd ever learned in that journey. And it was very difficult for him, very painful. And he had to deal a lot with pain. And he says, "I've had all kinds of therapy, speech, occupational, physical, aqua, everything, try harder, exert your will. Stroke becomes a playing field for a whole new level of achieving. How much progress can you make?" And then I found myself in a peaceful surrender in the karmic unfolding of my life. Many of the doctors have been very curious about me. They were curious about the fact that I wasn't reacting the way they expected me to. One doctor said to me, "How can you be happy when you've had a stroke?" I said, "Because my awareness is on another plane. My awareness isn't material. It's not part of the brain. Thoughts are in the brain, but awareness isn't." That didn't seem to mean much to the doctor, but it was making all the difference to me. So his father wrote a little thing about his father, and that's what we're going to use for a prayer of gratitude and contentment. So just take a nice full breath and exhale. As my father grew older, he slowed down a lot, as people often do. He began to approach each task with a great deliberation and patience. Each action, whether getting into the car, climbing the few steps to the house, or settling into his favorite armchair, was accompanied by such attention that it became almost a kind of meditation. He found satisfaction in the completion of each small task. He would smile with contentment and say quietly, "There we are." You and I have been exploring together the vehicle of this book, trying to figure out what the next stage of our lives might be like and how it might fit into the deeper dimensions of our being. My wish for each of us is that we might settle into aging, and that feeling I sensed in Dad, that feeling of release and completion and fulfillment.